Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 5 from a guy called Gerald, Essence. Okay then, so after Black Secret Technology, Gerald took a break for a few years. Between that album and this one, we did get that Cryogenics album in 1999 I mentioned in the Hot Lemonade review, which by some miracle I actually have heard now. Someone in my comments was nice enough to provide me with a download, and I think an unofficial upload somewhere on YouTube turned in my recommendations later. So I guess it is possible to hear that one now, because the internet can be kind of cool like that sometimes. I'm still not actually going to review that album, because as I kind of suspected, it's just a comp of B-sides and unreleased tracks that didn't make the cut for his regular albums, a few of which I'd already heard because they were like on singles he had on Bandcamp, and even talked about some of these in previous videos in this series. But it certainly was cool for what it was. It's out there for anyone curious. But anyway, we jump to the year 2000. There's another change in label over to Studio K7? Or just Studio K7, I guess. His Juicebox label had gone inactive. He ended up on this sort of indie label instead. As for the actual music, this project does mostly stick to pretty similar territory as seen on his last album, though there are definitely different strengths and weaknesses. Essence is a lot more song-oriented. Nearly every track on here is a prominent vocal guest, mostly from Wendy Page, who sings 6 of the 15 tracks on here. She's the singer from So Many Dreams on his last album. And there's 2 vocal appearances from Gerald's brother, David Simpson. 1 vocal appearance from Louise Rhodes of Lamb, and 1 from Lady Miss Kier from Delight of all people. Now, this project is not as varied or creative as Black Secret Technology. I do have more respect for that one than I do for this, since that one felt like it was more out of the box, more interesting, more ahead of its time. These kinds of sounds weren't nearly as novel by the time we got to the 2000s. But on the other hand, the production on this one is a massive step up from his last 2. Way more well-balanced and satisfying in letting each sound get the space it needs to breathe and form the right atmosphere he was going for. If I'm not in the right mood, this thing can run together in a big blur, but if I am in the right mood, then this can even surpass Black Secret Technology. I guess I would rank them about equally overall, just for different reasons. In terms of individual tracks, I admittedly have a lot of the same things to say about most of these tracks. A lot of the same mixes of smooth and spacey synth pad progressions, fast-paced break beats, occasional jazz instrumentation, what you would expect for this kind of genre. Though it's hardly so one note that I'd be mistaking any of these tracks for each other. For instance, even though Wendy Page handles vocals on 6 different tracks here, I have pretty different opinions on each of them. She's on 2 really good smoother cuts, 2 bangers, and 2 lower points. The 2 smoother highlights with her on it are Fever or a Flame and Glow. The former is probably the more memorable one, really do like the kind of more cinematic and nocturnal atmosphere it creates, even if it does maybe run on a tad long, and Paige occasionally sings like she has something in her mouth. And Glow, while not as catchy, I don't know, she still really put her heart into that performance and definitely brings that uplifting positive energy. The 2 bangers she's on are both near the end, Universal Spirit and Landed. I guess Universal Spirit sounds pretty similar to Fever or a Flame with its airy string pads, but the break beats on this one feel much heavier and more intense. The synth bass is a lot pluckier and more wobbly sounding, I guess, I don't know. Feels a lot more like a banger, even with Paige's pretty catchy hook bringing everything together really effectively. And Landed, that's the album's closer, finishing with the most intense and energetic cut of them all. The stabbing bass lines are even more intense, the break beats are even heavier and more chaotic. There's like some rough guitar distortion and like funky spy guitar licks or something thrown in there for even more texture. And Paige's voice has this gurgling filter place over it that makes her sound especially demented and off-kilter. That one really goes hard. Really wish it didn't just end in a fade out, but you know, I'll still take it. The 2 lower points were Multiplies and Beaches and Deserts, both of which were perfectly fine tracks, by the way. Though in the former, like, I guess Paige doesn't put quite as much passion into her performance as she does on those bigger standouts. Like, at one point she even sounds like she's yawning, which kind of took me out of it. And while Beaches and Deserts did have a nice, like, smooth down-tempo vibe that could let it live up to its title, the lyrics could get a little basic and overly predictable in the way, like, she keeps bringing up opposite adjectives, Like when she started singing from good to bad, from happy to sad, I was like, you could have thought of something a little more interesting than that. I know lyrics don't really matter that much in this kind of music, or the kind of thing that like is supposed to necessarily grab your attention beyond your usual uplifting sentiments, love and heartbreak, etc. You get the idea. Just that little moment did distract me a bit. Still, you cannot say that Wendy Page wasn't a versatile presence on this project. She is still really good on pretty much all of these. And thankfully, there's no shortage of great stuff beyond these tracks. Humanity with Louise Rhodes, for instance. Not only does Rhodes have kind of like a more melancholy and reserved tinge to her performance to help set herself apart, but this track has an even more textured instrumental than usual, the synths and breakbeats going up against some extra upright bass and vibraphones, even a little MIDI trumpet solo or two in there. This is one of the easiest and biggest highlights in the project. I love the way this one sounds. The two tracks with David Simpson definitely help make for some variety. Could You Understand? That one doesn't stand out much from a sonic perspective aside from the fact that it has male vocals instead of female. Though there are also some lyrics about, like, his struggles growing up in the hood, which are pretty unspecific and don't really go into much of any detail, just kind of delivering the core sentiment and that's about it. But hey, a track like this didn't need to be about anything in particular. I appreciate that touch all the same. But the other track with his vocals, I Make It, was much more of a highlight to me. That one just pops out in the mix way more with all the Jock Jam Orchestra hits, bubbling synth bass, humming vocal samples in the background, and various string pads coming and going. And that's all before Simpson's vocals or the beat even comes in. That one sounds really freaking cool. By the way, David Simpson is definitely a better singer than Gerald himself. Feels like he has a lot more control over his voice and hits notes more easily. But I digress. And then, of course, there's the track with Lady Miss Keir, Hurry to Go Easy. That one is exactly as good as you would expect it to be if you're familiar with D-Light. While the instrumental sounds like basically all the other ones on this album, and Lady Keir's vocals may have like the same tone as someone like Wendy Page, she just puts a lot more personality and flair into her performance than anyone else here, putting like a bunch of wavering flourishes into her voice sometimes, and even breaking out into scatting in a few different parts, which, yeah, that was pretty awesome. There's even 2 instrumental cuts on this thing, and while they aren't that sonically different from everything else here, they are definitely a welcome addition. The First Breath being a really solid opener to the album that lets you know what you're getting into with its futuristic sounding synth pads. And Final Call, that was even better, much darker sounding stuff with this slow, off-key trumpet-like repeating and getting really filtered and messed around with, while the beat underneath really bangs and has this really intense bass line, and there's also those creepy synth string pads that come in later as well, and the beats get shifted around a little and play like forward and reverse really quickly. Not quite like a record scratch, but something kind of like that. It's all a really cool mix, and having this stranger, marginally more experimental sounding moment like this is definitely welcome. Oh yeah, and there's a few spoken word interludes as well for extra flavor. The intro, The Universe with Jennifer Neal, is a nice little bit of science and philosophy that does get me pretty hyped for the album I'm about to hear, for instance. The other 2 aren't as notable. Alien Report with Public Domain is a straightforwardly delivered police report describing an alien who is like speeding or something in his spaceship. That was pretty cool, even if it can just totally pass you by and it's like 20 seconds. And Scale Circle, I didn't even pick up on what was being said at all on my first 2 return listens because of how the spoken word vocals have all that filtering on them. But it's talking about like how the universe is made of galaxies and stars and planets, and then scaling downwards to molecules and atoms and elementary particles. There's barely anything to this track. It really doesn't add anything that notable, but I still never skipped it. And as a whole, there are other issues I have with Essence, like the fact that most tracks on here end in a fade out, which felt pretty anticlimactic every time. Worst on the closer for obvious reasons, though it's not like he didn't set you up for it with how many other tracks on here also just fade out. Would have been nice to get some cuts that had more of a climactic finish, but, you know, still, all that aside, I still really enjoyed myself from start to finish with this thing. Most of these issues I have still, they feel like nitpicks. Fact remains is that the sound design of this thing was just super smooth, super immersive. The way it went up against all these hard-hitting breakbeats made for an album that can both bang or be relaxing, depending on which mood you're in. Probably a little better for the latter scenario, but Yeah, all the vocal guests were great, all the melodies and hooks were really nice, the production was great. This is just a rock-solid ambient drum and bass album with no strings attached, and even in its weakest moments is still really good for what it is. Gerald may not be as ahead of the curve here as he was on previous albums, but that certainly didn't mean his skills for making great music diminished any. This is definitely worth giving a shot for any drum and bass fans, and I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me reviews, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
Something's really happening. Smoke the size of